Hey to all Metal Maniacs and welcome to another episode on Iron Horror channel. Every weekend I grab a subject, a period of time in heavy metal, a particular genre, and I speak about it and I give the information relative to that period, to that subgenre, select my favorite albums as a description of what I love from that period of time. This time around I'm going to speak about a particular geographical area from which a number of bands came early in the 80s. I'm speaking about the Scandinavian area, mainly Sweden and Denmark. There was a big wave influenced by the new wave of British heavy metal, where a number of bands were grabbing their instruments and trying to put out their own music. The peculiarity with these bands is that they have, most of them, specific characteristics which identify them with them being either Swedish or Danish in most cases. So without further ado, let's go straight to the list of albums I chose to represent this period of time in heavy metal. Let's go. Welcome back to another episode, and for those who are new here, our job on this channel is to review albums, review festivals, suggest particular bands, speak about heavy metal in general, even about the cultural aspect of heavy metal. So if you like this content, if this is your area of interest, please consider subscribing and liking and sharing our videos on social media. That will really help us in order to delve and share the word of heavy metal as much as possible. So in this episode, as I said in the introduction to this video, I will be speaking about heavy metal coming from the Scandinavian countries, focusing on the style of classic heavy metal and the period ranging from early 80s until the late 80s, so to speak. But the pinnacle of the movement was between 82 and 86. Influenced highly, as I said, by the new wave of British heavy metal, which was going really strong in the UK. A lot of bands in Sweden and in Denmark mainly were popping out of nowhere and grabbing their instruments and starting playing and writing their own music. This is not to say that the bands here totally copied the new wave of British heavy metal, but rather they gave it their own imprint. The music here is quite melodic, riff-based as well, catchy choruses, keyboards in certain bands. In some of the bands, the keyboards are actually in the forefront, giving a more melodic touch. In fact, they are categorized under melodic metal to a certain extent. This group of bands, this wave of bands, is not really a movement, but rather a period in time where bands flourished more in an area with not that much big of a population in Sweden and in Denmark, even rarely in other countries of Scandinavia. When I say Scandinavia, I'm incorporating mainly Norway, Sweden and Denmark, and to a certain extent even Iceland, but there will not be any Icelandic bands, not even Norwegian bands, but I will come to that later on. This video has bands mainly from Sweden and Denmark. Other difference with the new wave of British heavy metal scene is that the Swedish bands, even in their initial stages, seemed and sounded a bit more professional. Even the clarity of the production, the way they put forward their music, and this apparently seems to stem from the fact that they received at the time funding from the government. There was a system which helped bands. I'm not sure if it was a system that covered all arts, but for sure in the musical sphere there was some kind of system built to support artists in their beginnings, and therefore the bands had a more of a cleaner approach compared to the new wave of British heavy metal, which was more of a DIY scene, a more working class scene, a more influenced by punk to a certain extent, and that attitude, whereas the bands coming from Denmark and Sweden resembled more the sound and the approach of Deep Purple, Scorpions, that kind of melodic hard rock metal, synonymous with those bands who are making obviously the rounds at the time, being the successful bands that they were and still are. As I said a few minutes ago, the biggest anomaly here is that even during my research in order to gather the information for this video, it was hard for me to find Norwegian bands playing this style of music. I'm not sure the reason behind this. Maybe some of you have more information about this. Some of you maybe have lived through this period and might shed some light on why this is so. It's an interesting thing considering the vicinity between these countries, yet compared to Sweden and Denmark, the amount of classic heavy metal bands coming out of this country is really low. So if you know and you can suggest some bands from Norway, please write it down in the comments, or else shed some light as the reason behind this interesting anomaly. So moving on from the geo-cultural aspect of the music, and let's go straight to the first album on this list, and I'm starting with the main album that represented this wave of bands that I'm referring to in this video, and I'm speaking about the album by Heavy Load from Sweden, titled Death or Glory, released in 1982 under the label of Thunderload Records. The Viking-themed cover art might make you think this is some kind of extreme metal being presented here, but this is rather a classic heavy metal band through and through. Exceptional music on here, characteristics that we find common throughout this wave of bands, which is catchy choruses, as I said, great lead guitars, guitar solos, quite acceptable production in most cases, in others even above acceptable actually. We find the vocals of Ragne Valkvist and Eddie Malm, which are quite recognizable, at least to those who have been listening to Heavy Load for some years now. This album is all that is great about this sound coming from mainly from Swedish bands. The opening track, Heavy Metal Angels in Leather and Denim, is an anthem of this style of music. The Guitar of Is My Sword is another epic track. Little Lies, which is another favorite of mine on here, but this is for me the best Heavy Load album and filled with killer tracks from start to finish. So if you want to start listening, start delving deep down in this scene, in this period of time, this is the right album to start with. If you like this, you're off to a good start. Next album on the list is again from a band from Sweden, released in 1983, and I'm speaking about the self-titled album by the band Torch. Over here we see a band that grabs the Judas Priest sound, assimilates it, gives it a bit of Swedish flavor, and then puts it back out for the listeners, and that's the biggest comparison I can make to the sound of this band. Just listen to the track Watchers of the Night and tell me that track wouldn't be a perfect fit on an album such as Screaming for Vengeance or Defenders of the Faith. Although my favorite track over here would probably be Battle Axe, and it gives me the feeling that to just put my battle vest on, pour a pint of beer and just headbang like crazy. It is another landmark album of the Swedish scene and of this wave of bands from this area during the early 80s. The next album is by a band called Gotham City, and the title of the album is The Unknown. As you can see, I don't have this album in my collection. If you're asking why, and you might as well go on Discogs, search the album and see how much it goes for. Unfortunately, it has never been re-released, and to find the original copies, it's not easy to find one, and if you find one, you have to put out some heavy cash. Anyways, it was released in 1984 by Fingerprint Records. It's very similar sounding to Heavy Load to a certain extent, but in certain parts it's more new wave of pretty heavy metalish. Just listen to the track. If I remember, The Beast Will Burn, and that's basically, if you don't know who's playing on that track, you will think that it is from a band from the new wave of British heavy metal. I think my favorite track on here would be Going Insane, but even the opening track is good. This album is really, really good. The cover art, the yellow reddish coloring, and the illustration is very popular in the underground scene as well. I've seen a couple of bootleg t-shirts at festivals as well. Yes, another landmark album which definitely shouldn't be missed. Another band from Sweden on this list before we go across the border towards Denmark, and the next band is Overdrive with the album Swords and Axes. It was released in 1984 by Planet Records. Production wise, this is a little bit more polished than the previous 3 albums, but the thing I love most about this album is that guitar tone. It's so crunchy, so 80s. Just listen to that intro on Sword and Axis. It's so good. It's almost a certain part speed metal to a certain extent, and but if I had to choose a favorite track on here, it would be Burn in Hell, which was the first track I've ever heard from this album, and made me delve deeper in the other tracks. So anyway, another great album from this wave of bands which shouldn't be missed. So we have arrived to the 5th album on this list. I already gave you 4 landmark albums coming from bands from Denmark and Sweden from the early 80s. You already have plenty of material if you have never listened to these 4 albums to keep your time occupied for the next couple of weeks, and we're not halfway there yet. As I said, we're going to Denmark now, and one of my favorite albums from this country, apart from Merciful Fate, of course, and King Diamond, and I'm speaking about Witchcross and the album Fit for Fight. Released in 1984 with Roadrunner Records, therefore quite a renowned label. It follows the same pattern of the other albums I mentioned on this list, mainly Heavy Load and even Torch, with thinner vocals compared, more high-pitched, but they fit so well with the progression of the tracks on this album. The melody and catchiness on this album abounds, and you can really hear the influence of the new wave of British heavy metal. It's one of the factors that really attracts me to the bands here, because they grabbed something so successful, so good like the new wave of British heavy metal, and really gave it an identity of their own without going against the attitude, the approach of those bands coming at the time from the UK. Favorite track on here would be Rocking the Night Away. Another favorite track here for me is X-Dance as well, but anyway, even Night Flight to Tokyo, another great album from start to finish. Witchcross, Fit for Fight. So let's remain in Denmark now, and another band from Roadrunner Records, and I'm speaking about the band Maltese, Falcon, and the album Metal Rush. Maybe this might come as a surprise to most, and obviously as a Maltese guy I couldn't leave a band named Maltese Falcon, could I? But jokes apart, although this album was rated by Kerrang as the worst heavy metal album ever, but obviously we know these kind of big famous magazine reviewers, most of the time they don't have any idea of what they're talking about. Although this is not a masterpiece or an album that changed the course of heavy metal, I think this is a very solid album. It's really catchy, great guitar tone as well, great production. The main gripe with reviewers at the time were the vocals on this album, but I really don't mind them. It's like a mix of Brian Johnson from AC/DC at times and a cleaner, more European approach to vocals in certain other parts. The opening track, Alive, is an up-tempo 80s classic track. The track Rats could easily be taken from a Motley Crue album, especially Shout at the Devil. Heavy and Loud is another kind of Judas Priest number. You have all the ingredients here for a nice listen to an album which really delivers. It never disappointed me whenever I put this album on my turntable. Production could have been a bit better at times because it kind of drowns certain parts of the track. The instruments don't have enough space to show their potential, but all in all it doesn't bother me that much that stops me from listening to this album. So we will remain now in 1984 but move back to Sweden with another classic record from this wave of bands, and I'm speaking about the band Glory Bells Band and the album Century Rendezvous, released with the aptly named Sounds of Scandinavia Records. The sound here is kind of a mix of Judas Priest and Tin Lizzy to a certain extent. The vocals move from sounding like Rob Halford at times or Robert Plant from Led Zeppelin, but on the lower register the vocals here doesn't really sound like any of those two, more on the higher parts. So this album brings a lot of diversity even in their sound. As I said, if you listen to the track Indian Rain Song, it actually sounds like a track from Tin Lizzy. An odd track on this album would probably be the track My Life, which sounds kind of like an Elton John song, yet I don't find it out of place on this album. The lyrics are very powerful. It's like an autobiographical story by the vocalist here, and you can hear the emotion in his voice while singing these lyrics. Once you will search for it and read the lyrics, you will understand to what I'm referring here. But the highlight of this album is the opening track, just Flight Back Home, with that familiar opening riff. Go listen to this track and keep in mind that this was released in 1984. So if you hear the familiarity in the riff, in the opening riff on this track, keep in mind that the more famous band that used or copied, or might be a coincidence as well, we don't know, the album which released by the other famous band was released later in the 80s. Let me know in the comments if you recognize this riff and if you knew about it before this video as well, because that is an interesting aspect as well. Moving on to 1985 now, remaining in Sweden, and my next choice on this list is the self-titled album by the band Universe. Another highlight album of this scene, of this wave of bands, very popular within fans of these bands. The sound here is a bit more melodic than the previous albums I mentioned, a bit almost bordering AOR. If you had to look at the cover art of this album, it is very 80s minimalistic to a certain extent. I don't know how much time they dedicated to make this album cover. I don't think it was that much, but the music here is really good. The riff parts, although being a bit more on the melodic side, are still there, but the melody really orchestrates itself really well with those parts, and everything flows really beautiful. It's impressive how an album of this style, which would appeal to a bigger audience, really didn't make any hit around the world. Their sound here is quite similar to the band Europe. I'm referring to Europe around the late 80s, so you might wonder how one band really makes it to be so successful and the other one which produces something as good, if not even better. For me, this album I think is better than most albums, if not all the albums ever released by Europe. But anyway, I mean, that's the law of the jungle, or law of the music industry in this case. Speaking of Europe, apparently the lead guitarist on this band was briefly in a band with John Norum of Europe, and that explains obviously the similarities between the two bands I'm referring to here. But anyway, if I had to choose a favorite track from this album, it would probably be Weekend Warrior. Next on the list is the record that I discovered first from the bands mentioned on this list, and it's probably the one which is least known out of all these records, and I'm speaking about the album Caught in a Trap by the band Lynx, released by Mill Records in 1985. It's a Swedish band, again highly on the melodic side, but the tracks are so catchy here, and you'll find yourself repeating these tracks in your mind after you have stopped listening to the album. But the tracks rather than becoming uninteresting after a number of listens, because most of the times when we speak about catchy music tends to be liked immediately, but then it starts boring you quickly as well. But on most of these records I mentioned, even though there's a melodic side, there's a catchy side to it. Over a long period of time, to me at least, these records never became dull, never became monotonous. Not only that, I have to, every time I remember some of these records, I have to put some of the tracks on, because I feel like a longing to listen to these tracks and to these albums. Actually, at the time there was a track, the track I discovered this band with, which is titled On My Own, which when I searched on YouTube there wasn't even a video of this track. In fact, I have uploaded this track myself at the time. I've been meaning to get a copy of this album ever since on vinyl, but again, like previous albums which I don't have yet in my collection, there has been no re-release of this record, and the original copies, if you find one, will cost you quite a bit. In order to put you in the picture of what this band sounds like, it would be kind of a mix between Europe, heavy load, and a cleaner sounding band from the new wave of British heavy metal, such as Tigers of Pentang or Tokyo Blade. Other favorite tracks on this record, apart from My Own Way, which I have mentioned already, would be Win or Lose and Master of Evil. But anyway, this is a very consistent album from start to finish. I love it so much, and if you get your chance to own a copy of this record, I advise you not to lose the opportunity, because it's really good and you won't find many copies around, as I said, for sale. 10th and last album from this list, and I'm going back to Denmark here with the album Future World by the band Pretty Maids, released in 1987. Pretty Maids, who might be the most successful band from the bands listed in this video here, and this is not to say they made it that big, but I think it's the one that is the most known out of all the bands. With regards to the sound, the music here is like a mix from Love at First Sting era Scorpions mixed with some early Wasp. Just check out tracks such as Rodeo and or Needles in the Dark, and you will understand the comparison that I have given. This album oozes 80s aura, in the sense it's bombastic, it's kind of that sweaty, macho feeling of the 80s. I'm a big fan of the 80s, if you haven't understood this yet. Everything, the imagery, the fonts used, the design of the cars, the television shows, the movies, and not least heavy metal from the 80s, even other styles of music from the 80s to a certain extent. So this album really appeals to me, even though the rest of the albums also have that feel, but this one, considering it was released in 1987, so that 80s style had been much more ingrained in society, so to speak. This album here really exemplifies all that. Just listen to that synth intro on the opening track Future World. It's kind of a soundtrack from an 80s movie. In any self-respecting 80s album, there's always a ballad, and in this case it's Eye of the Storm. I wanted to mention it because I'm not always a big fan of ballads, but this one right here is a really emotional one, and listen to that guitar solo, really filled with emotion. I mean, that's the only word I can say to describe it. Yes, this is another great record, and a great fit in this list, a great way to close off these 10 records, so that it is Pretty Maids with the album Future World. So those were the 10 records which I had for you from this episode, coming from Scandinavian countries in the early 80s, playing classic heavy metal. More than Scandinavian in this case was Swedish and Danish bands, but again I remind you, for those who have suggestions with regards to Norwegian bands playing classic heavy metal from the early to mid 80s, please write them down in the comments. I would be gladly check them out and give my feedback on them and my opinions, in order to create a discussion, which is, as I always say, the idea behind these videos. A lot of bands mentioned here came from, as I said, a particular region, a particular period of time, but nonetheless, when you hear the records on this list, there is a diversity between each and every track and each and every record here on this list. Contrary to previous videos I did, this video was pretty difficult to narrow the list down to 10 records. It pains me to look at the records I have left out from this list, and as I was compiling the information for this video, I already made sure to keep the information, because I will be doing a part 2 of bands coming, which would be a good fit to a video titled Bands from Scandinavia playing early classic heavy metal from the 80s. I didn't have this difficulty with previous videos, but this one was quite difficult to say the least. So that's all we have for today. I hope you like the content and the information. I hope I helped you discover new bands and new albums. If you like the content, please consider subscribing, liking and sharing this video on social media, as I always say, in order to share the word of heavy metal. Below in the description you will find links, affiliate links to buy merch from these bands or to buy the album, directly the album. We get a small commission if you buy through those links, to no extra expense for you. So that will help us to recoup a very small portion of our expenses in order to make this channel viable. So if you can, please, it would be appreciated if you use those links to buy merch. That is all I have left. I hope to see you on the next episode. Until then, stay safe and metal on. Cheers.